My son lost a tooth the other night, and before he fell asleep, he said, "Tell me the truth, Daddy, are you the tooth fairy?" And I don't like to lie to my kids, so I said, "Yes, honey, Daddy is the tooth fairy." And then he thought for a minute and he said, "You mean you go all over the world and gather the teeth from all of the children?" And it just made my heart soar, and the lie perpetuates. It just reminded me of the pure, innocent, unconditional love I feel towards family. And this time of year is very special to me. It's back to school. This morning I dropped my kids off for their first day of school for the new year. And it was my mom's favorite time of year. She would love buying the supplies in our little backpacks and sending us in that first day. She loved it probably for different reasons. For me, it's a reminder of the tenderness and the love that I think is at the core of the breadth and the certainty, if there is any, in my painting. Love. There's that great Kenneth Clark quote, "Facts become art through love." And he talks about how in the landscape, all of that embracing love is manifest in the treatment of light. And light, as a landscape painter, is something that's always on my mind. What kind of light do I want to have in my paintings? How do I suggest light where there can't possibly be light? Do I want symbolic light, like Turner, for instance, or do I want something more naturalistic, like Constable? Do I want a light that caresses and finds form, like Rembrandt Peale, for instance? Or do I want the kind of light that fractures and splinters in favor of something more overall, something more surface-oriented, like late Monet? Light is extremely important to me as a landscape painter. And we recently went to Yale Museum for British Art up in New Haven, and there was a fabulous show of the St. Ives painters, a coterie of painters, mostly from the 1940s, 50s, although they did start earlier, who worked in the fishing village of St. Ives in Cornwall. And I remember my great mentor, Michael Tyzack, the British painter, would always talk about these painters, and he knew a lot of them personally. He would always talk about Peter Lanyon in vis-a-vis my work. And so I've always had a kind of man crush on Peter Lanyon and his work. The notion that he is a landscape painter when he wakes up, and when he hits the pillow, he's still a landscape painter. But he uses the process of abstraction to peel back layers, to get at something more elemental, to exaggerate form, to intensify experience, and to suggest not only the external world, but the feeling of orientation in the internal world, which is something that's very, very interesting to me. What I also learned in this show, in studying a lot of these painters, was the way that they would immerse themselves in that landscape in Cornwall. Barbara Hepworth, for instance, would walk out to the edge of a cliff, extend her arms, close her eyes, and then just inhale the saltiness and the spray, the wind. I love wind also. Peter Lanyon would lay face down on the earth and just inhale deeply the musky, fecund scent of the earth. I've been known to do that as well, to lay face down on the ground. You can learn a lot about something by laying on top of it and inhaling. Glenn Gould, my hero, the Canadian pianist, would take long walks into the woods in Ontario, north of Toronto, and conduct in the air to cows or to trees or to the lakes. Always alone, always internalizing the experience of nature. For myself, all growing up, I would take our John boat out, about a 10-foot John boat, down in the swamps of South Carolina, and I would lay down, face up to the sky, and then just drift through the back swamps, bumping into cypress knees and just letting the wind and the current take me wherever it did, with snakes and stuff slithering underneath, and there were bugs overhead, and just daydream. I would also take a large, like, refrigerator box and cram it into a thicket of leaves and vines in the woods, and then crawl inside the box. And there, and daydream or draw. For me, it's always about the notion of containment in the proscenium of nature, in the rawness of nature, but always with that layer of protection. I am a landscape painter who essentially doesn't care that much about the landscape. I care about the internalization of it. I care about the immutable fixed position of placement, where the tree trunk slams into the horizontal earth, that bulletproof marking of location. That's what I want to try to express in my paintings, or I want them to extend to the viewer. That feeling of placement. Not necessarily an allusion to the world outside, but an affirmation of the world inside, kind of a mediator between the walls of the room and the physical flesh of the viewer. I want the painting hung low and thick and subject to all of the gravity and the drips and the physicality of a physical body. That marking, that solitary marking of place. One place, the painting; the other place, the viewer. It very much in a way, we, as we stand in front of a painting, are a place ourselves. We mark place. We are a place. And that's very, very interesting to me as a painter. It's something I continue to study. I love being dialed into a location, and that awareness, that feeling of orientation is especially enhanced when you're in remote locations completely alone. That's where you can truly dial into that feeling, that experience of being in a place. And to me, that's the greatest testament, the greatest tribute to the love that I suggested at the top of this, the love that, at least for me, glues everything together. When I was in graduate school here in New York City at the School of Visual Arts, this had been about 1987, 1988, I had the honor of meeting the art historian and writer Clement Greenberg. And he came into my studio and sat down, and we had a really nice conversation. And he liked very much the work that I was doing. He liked my rigorous devotion to material. At that time, I wasn't painting on canvas. I was painting on big stacked blocks of cardboard that I got off the street with electrical tape and wire and masking tape. They were big environments that you would immerse yourself in, all with the application of paint, but many other elements at the same time. And he liked very much that attention to materiality and to trying to compress something into the material itself. All things that would help me later as a painter. And I remember him asking me, what did it cost me to become a painter? An interesting question, and one that I revisit often. What does it cost? I happen to believe that it has to cost something. I was a very shy kid. I learned very early on the importance of solitude. I learned how to embrace solitude, that glorious aloneness that I think is a prerequisite to being a painter. I didn't have a sip of alcohol until I was in college. I lost my virginity quite late. It's too embarrassing to say what age, but it was, I graduated college a virgin. Because, I had plenty of friends and girlfriends in college, but I was devoted to work, to just showing up and going to my studio and working. I had no interest in, I thought of myself, and still do, really as a person who makes things. I make things with my hands. I make something that wasn't there before. I never thought of myself as an aspiring artist. I hate this, such a bullshit word. I hate the word he was an aspiring painter. To aspire, to me, sounds like you're trying to win the validation of someone else. I never aspired to anything. I think when I turned 16 or 17, I simply declared, now I'm a painter, and I kept showing up, just as I do now, the same thing. The only time I don't feel like a painter is when I'm actually painting. When I'm painting, I feel like someone who's making things again. And that's been a very healthy way of looking at it for me personally. It takes a lot of the pressure off. There's a great Picasso quote that he talks about possessing so much technique that it vanishes. That's something certainly I would love to achieve one day in my lifetime. I detest technique for technique's sake. And that sounds crazy because I put a lot of emphasis on the materiality of my work, on the brush strokes, thick, creamy paint, gesture, all of those things on the surface. But what I'm trying to do is simply gain enough experience with applying paint that I can simply walk into my studio and simply be with paint. And that hopefully when the viewer stands in front of it, they do not, skateboard over technique and through style, but they feel like they're being with paint also, in the moment, fresh, just as I've put it on, again, kind of that one-to-one relationship of viewer to artist through the paint, the manipulation of the paint. Now I do love style, again, is a tricky question. I love kitsch. I grew up around kitsch, and the notion of style for style's sake suggests a kind of hasty love of misplaced priorities that I am completely seduced by. But in my work, it's not that important to me. It's important to me that I show up every single day and gain experience with my materials, so much so that eventually, hopefully, I can just communicate without thinking about it. That's the key word for me, is not to think. I just simply come in and I be with paint. There's nothing weaker than a painting that tries to do too many things. I don't come in and aspire to do anything. I simply come in and I be with paint. I guess it didn't cost me anything. I want to talk about a painter I love, Raphaelle Peale, the American still life painter who lived from 1774 to 1825, who also has a name I'd love to steal. I've always loved Peale's still lifes for their very, very simple, direct, and in my opinion, very American presentation of objects. Very simple lighting, clean proscenium, very parallel to the surface, full of all of the certainties promulgated by the ancient Greeks, ideas of proportion, light and dark treatment, purity of line, all very classical ideas, but all seen through the fixity of a view, through his view. Very, very direct, never about the individual objects, but the arrangements of those objects. Le Corbusier used to talk about objects of poetic reaction. I get the same feeling in these Peales, objects chosen for their power aesthetically, poetically, and symbolically, all arranged very carefully. And it's interesting, they are very still, very static, but they are brought to life, brought into motion through our eyes. Our eyes bring the motion as we look at the lines, as we move across the surfaces. We bring the vitality into the fixed view. It's interesting to contrast these with another great American, Bill Traylor, who worked in the first half of the 20th century. And these images are very difficult to describe. You have to see them in person. They're singular in their command of space, their marking of place, and I can't think of another image maker as potent as Traylor was. And I had the great fortune of working in a gallery when I first moved to New York City called Cavan Morris Gallery. Very dear friends of mine, and I got firsthand exposure to these images. So I try to look again at as much as I can and try to bring a lot of these ideas to bear in the work that I do. I try to concentrate on very clear, simple designs, even though there are a lot of movement, a lot of color. The chassis of the thing is very still, very direct, and very fixed in these arrangements.